Hi, everyone. I'm Jeannie Ralston. I'm the co-founder of Next Tribe. Welcome. We're so excited. This is such an honor to have somebody, a writer of Joan Silver's stature here with us. And Joan has been writing for a long time, and she's going to talk about her work. And we're extra lucky because interviewing her is one of my favorite people in the world and one of Next Tribe's favorite contributors. She's done so much for Next Tribe, and I've known Sheila for a long time, but she's volunteered. She knows Joan from her back in her early days. So they're going to have a lot to talk about. We're going to get a really authentic kind of impromptu look at how of two very accomplished women talking about life and work. So that's so lucky for us. And I just want to say, I'm going to introduce Sheila, but before I get to her, I want to say that put your questions and comments in the chat, and later on in this hour, I will call on you and you can ask Joan the question yourself. And I know a lot of you like that, to be able to talk directly to the author. So Sheila is the author of 9 books, a number of them New York Times bestsellers. You probably, the best known of them is Girls Like Us, about Carole King, Carly Simon and Joni Mitchell. I had a blank. And she's written about women's issues and social and cultural topics for many magazines, including Vanity Fair, Glamour, and the New York Times Book Review, and New York Times Style. And she's happily a longtime contributor to Next Tribe. Thank you, Sheila, for being here.
Thank you, Amy. Hey, okay, well, I have the distinct, as they say, privilege and pleasure to interview and speak to my friend Joan Silver, who I've known since, to use a very uncliche term, since the dinosaurs roamed, when we were hip young waitresses at what were then the artist bars in Lower Manhattan. And we were kind of close in touch, and then intermittently in touch. And we've carried on a friendship and getting to know, being in touch all these many years since. And I've been so happy in the last number of years, actually a couple of decades, to see how Joan has won the esteem, the incredibly deserved esteem that she always merited. She's been called, I'm going to read this fast because there's so much to say about her. She's been called the finest fiction writer in America, America's version of Canada's Alice Munro, and much more. Her 8th book, Improvement, published 2 years ago, won the National Book Critics Circle Award, the PEN/Faulkner Award, was listed as one of the year's best by Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Kirkus, and more. Her previous book, Fools, was longlisted for the National Book Awards, was a finalist of the PEN/Faulkner, and called outstanding, beautiful, intricate, and wise by the New York Times Book Review. Her Ideas of Heaven was shortlisted for the National Book Award, and that was the year, 2004, when all the finalists were women, mostly in the New York area, and that created a lot of sexist uproar from certain men there. They were all friends, and they supported one another. I've adored her previous books, which are not quite as well known anymore, perhaps, because the more recent ones are about Buddhism in Southeast Asia, and the Ring of Stories turned into kind of polymorphic narration. We'll talk about that. Lucky Us, In the City, In My Other Life, and Household Words. These books seem to be were about kind of like leaving a suburb to become kind of a principled, cool bohemian in New York City. Lucky Us had the AIDS epidemic as a theme in it. Wonderful, wonderful books. All the books. Her recently published 9th book, Secrets of Happiness, is what we're going to talk about today, mainly. It has received, of course, rave reviews. Ann Patchett said, "It would be impossible to overstate how good this book is." PW called it a mesmerizing story, which brims with heart and intelligence. And the New York Times reviewer said, "Silver illuminates those invisible fissures, and inexplicable distances that we sense, however dimly, make up our shared lives. She aims in increments at the ecstatic." She's also gracious, generous, and modest, non-competitive. Several decades ago, I sensed she never seemed resentful of more famous writers. That was the line that I used in the piece I wrote for Next Tribe 2 years ago. And she's a lot of fun. And take it away, Joan.
Thank you. I'm going to start by reading a section from the book. So everyone will get a sense of, you know, what it's like and what my writing is like. And it's the beginning, I change narrators in each chapter. So it's the beginning of a new chapter and you don't really have to know anything before I read. I'm just gonna read for a couple minutes. And the character who's talking to you is someone called Rachel. My brother's longtime boyfriend decided to leave him once and for all. Enough, he said, was enough. If you can't stop arguing after 20 years, when will you ever? Time for a new start for both of them. They would always be friends, of course. He would always care about Saul, but he did not think that waking up every day in the same apartment was good for either of them. This speech might have made some sense, except that my brother had just been diagnosed with some stage or other of leukemia, lymphocytic leukemia, and it was hard to get a full story out of Saul. And the apartment in the upper reaches of Manhattan belonged to Kirk, the boyfriend. My brother, a 57-year-old librarian with no personal savings, was going to have to find a new place to live. For however long he planned to do that. I was stunned and outraged by the news, maybe more than my brother was. Why had I ever liked Kirk? I always had. With his deep voice, his good haircuts, his quiet, merciless jokes. He called me Sister Susie. My name is Rachel. The name was his kidding. Sister Susie was a pricky lass, always getting into the gin on the sly. We had a whole set of stories about her and her unusual relationship with her dog Spot. Some of his friends thought I was really called Susie. How could you decide to break up with someone who had a mortal illness? Who could do such a thing? Kirk could. The man is a fuckhead, I said to Saul, and he has no honor. We never got along that well, Saul said. Remember when he picked a fight with me in front of the entire Brooklyn Library staff? He was always a pain. You know how full of himself he's been. He thinks being a digital art director is like being Michelangelo. I always laughed at the way he used the word creative. Don't make a big deal out of this. It's not the end of the world. What is then? I thought, but I didn't say it. Kirk had not given him any particular deadline for moving out, and everyone in New York knew couples who stayed together for years after breaking up, while prices rose and good deals slipped away. Meanwhile, Kirk and my brother were sharing the same bed every night and were, I gleaned from my brother's remarks, still having what could be called sexual contact. I didn't blame Saul for mentioning it either, showing off a last bit of swagger. And maybe the breakup was just an idea, a flash in the pan theory. Maybe Kirk didn't mean it. He says I'm lazy about being sick, Saul said. I should do more, be proactive.
My ring.
Has anyone used that word? Whoops. Has anyone used that word since 1997? Is it with him? I said. I don't get it. He's seeing someone new, Saul said. He's what? I said. I had to stop wailing in protest because it was useless and only increased my brother's suffering. He had his ties to Kirk. He didn't want to hear what I had to say. No big deal was his mantra, and there was probably a way to say it in Sanskrit or Pali. It's someone named Ethan, Saul said, a lawyer. Did I want to know his name? I did not. The Ethan who's mentioned is someone who's been in the first chapter, a few chapters before, so we, thank you for applauding. So we, we're hearing again, who this person, we're getting another view of this character, and it goes on from there. That's really dead in the middle, that section, right midway.
Yes, and your books are, all the people in your books connect in surprising and significant and offhand ways, and you never know where the connection is going to come. Yes, Ethan is a lawyer. We say that, and Ethan begins and ends the book. He discovers that his father had another wife and another family, and then we go to Joe, who was the child of that family. Yeah, right. And then I think, go to Rachel soon after that. And it comes back to Ethan. And the connections are kind of like the connections in life are when you live long enough and you talk about the people that knew so-and-so who knew so-and-so. They're surprising and significant and offhand. Do you want to talk about that method and why it's important to you? I know you said that this is a novel, but came from your last number of books were Ring of Stories books.
Right.
Yes, I remember that.
I've been doing sort of variations of this form for the last 5 books, and I started with linked stories in a ring. Then I would say, although one of them is actually called a novel, those 3 were really, 3 or 4 were, no, 3, I guess, were really stories. And then I wanted to make them more novel-like and connected. But they're basically the same form, and I don't even have a name for it or care to have one. But what I loved about it when I mean, I kind of stumbled on it as one often does as a fiction writer. I started with the book Ideas of Heaven, and I had a story I wanted to tell, and then I had a character who was sort of the villain in that story. He's a dancing coach who sort of torments the person he's teaching. And then I got his story, and then I thought, oh, that's really interesting to do that. And then I kept moving, I kept finding links and doing it. And I loved that so much. And what I felt like, in fact, after I finished Ideas of Heaven, I felt like I had done my best work in that form. And what I liked about it was that it allowed, I'm very interested in the kind of intimate gaze and in the very close, interior moment that somebody has, but I wanted to get a bigger canvas, and this let me do it. So I was able to get different perspectives, which I also really liked, and different angles on what was going on. But I had very intimate contact with each character. So I have just liked that, and I felt that it allowed me to do a lot of different things that I hadn't been able to do before, that the canvas got bigger in a way that was really important to me.
Okay, great. Your stories infuse us with Cambodia, Thailand, Nepal, even here, Malaysia and the Philippines. You're living in American cities, mainly New York, I think a little bit of Boston, I think Berkeley's in there, but you are completely infused with Southeast Asia. They're from there, they're half Thai, they go to Cambodia to do NGO work. And I know that you've traveled a lot. You've traveled there a lot, and you began practicing Buddhism. I think of your books as kind of before and after. I mean, the early books that I mentioned, Household Words, Lucky Us, In My Other Life, were bohemians in New York, kind of bohemians. Cool people in New York books. And then there was the infusion of Southeast Asia, these countries so significant in your travels, in your own journey, and why. And I felt I was wrapped in the culture by reading this book. I mean, there was no character that didn't have a part of her or him in one of these countries. Can you tell us why this is just, is there a message? Is there significance to it? Or is this just something that is so important to you, places that are important to you, and a culture and a religion or a spiritual life that's important to you? And so you write about it, and your characters live it.
It's 20 years ago that I first traveled to Asia. I saw a tour. It was originally a Buddhist tour that didn't run because I was interested in Buddhism, but I found another tour that went to China. And I'm a pretty good traveler, but I didn't feel like I could get up and travel to China alone. And I thought taking a tour was the dorkiest thing I'd ever heard of. I would never do such a thing, but it was a backpacker tour. So it was a little bit, less formal than, ones I dreaded, and I loved it. I was just thrilled with myself the entire time. I was actually in China, especially from my particular generation. I mean, China was closed off till 1979, actually. So a lot of our growing up period, it was, really remote. Anyway, I loved doing this, and I realized I could do it all the time. So I'd have lots of friends who'd been to Southeast Asia, had been to Thailand and places like that. And then I probably was in Laos and a little bit in Thailand, maybe a year and a half after the first visit. And I loved those places so much, I kept going back to them, and they were important. And in fact, it was my goal at one point. I was teaching, so I was on an academic schedule. I could take vacations twice a year, but it was my goal to just go to as many different countries in Asia as I could. And certainly, so I don't want to list all of them, but I've been to, you know, the more known ones. Thailand, I probably visited the most. And I taught, in recent years, I found volunteer work to do. So I was a month teaching English as a second language in Laos, and I was 2 weeks doing that in Chiang Mai in Thailand. So I had slightly closer contact with those places. They're very important to me. I think travel in general is important to me because travel is really, as everyone knows who does it, it clues you into the idea that the way you do it is not necessarily the way it's done.
Mhm.
You know, that there's a larger world out there. So it was very enlightening. And I have to say, even when I didn't have a good time someplace, I'm always glad that I've traveled. I'm always glad that I've been there. And of course, I've missed that, you know, in this time. But I always want to use that, and I feel like in some ways, the basic plot of everything I write is that someone starts out relatively shallow, whether they know it or not, and then they grow into a deeper sense of what life is about and what the world is. I mean, the plot sort of, maybe the basic form of fiction anyway, but I particularly have done that. So travel was really crucial in, you know, both in my own experience of that and in putting characters through that. I've just loved it. I also, you know, I know something from traveling, but I also read a lot. You know, the internet is of great service to me and allows me to, you know, have contact with all those places.
I love the way you said you learn more from life as you go on. That's a wonderful goal. I hope it's true. I thought for a long time it's true. That's beautiful. Another quality of your book is how real the characters are. I mean, obviously fiction writers, excellent fiction writers, write both male and female characters in a flawless way, whether it's first person, which your characters have been in these certainly in this book and some of the other ones, or third person where they're, you know, being quoted. Of course, some people, some novelists, and I'm not going to name a very famous male one who I think tried to do that, and for the novel that about 15 years ago was all the rage. And I said, I stopped reading it because I couldn't believe that it was really the character. It was the novelist being very good and trying very hard. Your characters in this first person book they are speaking. There's no Joan there. They are speaking. And I particularly found this, I think I emailed you a couple of times, with Bill/Bud, who takes up a good part of the, yes, he's this guy. I kept saying, he's this guy. There's no Joan here. He's the guy who, he's had quite an interesting life. His parents were very right wing. He lived his own life. He experienced a robbery. He became a bit of a robber. He moved to Boston kind of in the co-op, I think, became a taxi driver, a chauffeur, worked with labor unions or a labor union, then ended up in Cambodia with an NGO, and had a long relationship with, because I say that with Rachel, but yeah, they had an earlier one, and then they became friends afterward, Skyping. But again, he was so real and talking about his girlfriends and talking about his life. I mean, it was a guy's language. And as thinking of your books, especially some of the early ones like In My Other Life, I mean, there were male voices throughout. Is this something that has always been easy for you, something that you worked hard at, or something that was important? I mean, or just natural because you do it so well?
It's interesting, you know, when I was first teaching writing as well as writing like 35 years ago, there was a whole thing about write what you know, and people would make a big fuss if you wrote from the viewpoint of a character of another gender, if you wrote, if they were gay and you weren't gay, if you know, it was considered like just amazingly, you know, nervy to do that. And now, I mean, I know a lot of men, right? I mean, I know so it's not outside of my experience to do that. And I don't want to write about, you know, I don't want to write in my own voice all the time. I spend enough time with myself. So, you know, I'm perfectly comfortable writing as a man. I don't even, it's not that I don't think about it, but I I used to try and balance like male, female, and I don't keep count anymore. I don't care how many there are of each. Um, there are certain kinds of characters I can't do. You know, if they're utterly unlike me in lots of ways. I'm a lot like Bud. I mean, although I did not have right-wing parents, I ran away from my family in various, you know, metaphoric and actual ways. And I certainly have had a whole bunch of jobs and a whole bunch of, you know, sort of serial relationships. So you know, I know a lot about him. I feel close to him in lots of ways, which you know, if he were, you know, an executive in a large company, that would be harder for me. You know,
Right.
I wouldn't hear him all the time. So I love doing that. I mean, that's actually very pleasurable to me to be myself and sort of not be myself at the same time.
Right. I was
So
going to say, when you talked about how you, if it was an executive, you wouldn't know him. Your characters are always like effortlessly bohemian and cool. They're on a level of, I mean, you know, working as an NGO, working for labor unions, being a barista, a pastry chef, a filmmaker. I mean, these are to me are Joan characters.
right.
And, you know, and in your last book, you had somebody, a woman who was going with a guy who was in Rikers, right? For a drug thing, was it?
Oh,
Or something?
her boyfriend was in Rikers for
Yes.
Possessing a small amount of marijuana.
Yes, but he had a lot of integrity, and that was and that's you. I mean, I can't say, but knowing you as long as I do, that wouldn't rule a person out from having integrity. This is interesting. In this book, you have a lawyer, and he starts it and ends it, and that is kind of out of the Joan reference book, outside of the Joan group of people. So again, casually bohemian and cool and creative. That's kind of your world. But was there a reason you have a lawyer there, or not? You just wanted
No,
to?
I just wanted to give him. I wanted to give him a job I was somewhat familiar with.
Yes.
I wanted him to be sort of steady. You know, I didn't want him to be moving around so much.
Yes. Right.
I'm sorry.
His mother is a school teacher, which my mother was. So
yes,
it's hard to do.
I have one question just along these lines. I'm going to jump in. Which of the characters was the hardest for you to write? Which in this current book were most unlike you? I guess I'd ask.
The hardest, I don't know. I don't know that the ones unlike. It has more to do with how much I know about them when I start. I sort of knew where Bud was going to go, so he wasn't hard to write. The one that was the most difficult to write, and I redid it until I thought I got it, was the third chapter is told from the viewpoint of a woman named Maribel, who's a young English woman who's just she's kind of a low-level film crew person on a film that someone else is working on. But I had trouble, partly because she's English, I had trouble getting her, you know, and she's having an affair with someone who's married, and she kind of wants to be with him, but doesn't quite want to be with, you know. So it took a while to kind of get her vivid enough, and her feelings vivid enough. And it wasn't, I liked, when I came to the end of the chapter, she's actually thinking about the wife of the man she was having the affair with, and has a feeling of contact with her. And that helped me to kind of get her, to kind of get who she was.
That's interesting. She was very natural to me. I mean, I didn't think that she was a hard character. When you look at your early books, do you see the difference that I see between those group of 4 books and the post Buddhism travel books?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's some totally different to me.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm most invested in the last 5 books.
Yes, the last one. Yeah, I assume so. What are you working on now?
I'm working on it. It's in the same form. I'm in the very early kind of rough stages, but I have a character who is reminiscing about the 1970s, and he betrayed a friend and has regretted it for many years, but never told anyone. He's carried this secret all these years.
Another secret.
Another
secret.
So
you have a male character and another male character, or
yeah.
Yes, two men. Interesting. Why'd you go back to the 70s?
Well, because that's when I know the most about risky things happening.
Yeah,
So
okay.
it'd be time to go back to, but I've done lots of different eras. So it just, but
Yes,
in this
yes,
case, I went
yes.
back.
And Fools was about the 1920s. Dorothy
Yeah.
Day, Sacco Vanzetti. Okay, back to the 70s. We knew each other when we were waitresses, and we were. It was that crazy era. Now we have what I call feminism on steroids. Me Too, and just feminism everywhere, which is incredible and great, and social media and all this stuff. But the women now really what they consider abusive is something that we never
Right.
we never thought about.
Yeah.
What do you think of the different eras of feminism that we've lived through? Maybe three of them. The one that I think of our time is right before feminism, right at the beginning of it, when it was both kind of like a corrective and a extension of the kind of the sort of the crazy hip world that we lived in, and then later, kind of a careerism feminism, and then now this Me Too feminism that is where the bar is very high for these women, and men get booted out of jobs and get sued, and yes, get booted out of jobs, and their books get canceled when even if something that happened decades earlier. What do you think? And you teach also. I mean, I know that you're doing the Warren Wilson program, so I don't know how old these people are, the students, but certainly at Sarah Lawrence, you had younger students. How do the different eras of being a young woman in a city or not in a city, how do you think of them, the sort of the different eras over these years?
Let me sort of peel back and answer part of it, and then I'll
Yeah.
talk about students. I feel that like many of us, I feel that things that we took for granted are now, I think it's great that men are afraid they'll lose their jobs if they act like jerks. I think that's, and I feel in some ways that I learned something from the Me Too movement, because I would have just said, that's, you can just deal with that, don't worry about it. The part that I'm uncomfortable with is not the penalties for the most case that men are paying. I'm a little uncomfortable with women having too much of a sense of their own fragility. And
I think many of us are, yeah.
Yeah, and also we thought of sexuality as freedom, and it's much more. I mean, we had our own simplicities about that too, obviously, but there's a way in which there's a kind of assumption that it's not something that women want, or there's implications of that. So I think that's complicated, and it seems natural to me that we would keep hashing this out, and it would keep having different forms, and it would go this way and that way. But I think for the most part, the Me Too stuff has had good effects, and the people paying penalties, that's good. My students have varied. When I teach at Warren Wilson, I'm teaching adult students, so that's a little bit different.
Yes.
Although sometimes when I teach Warren Wilson students, they jump on, they'll read Dennis Johnson and will say, "Oh my God, he's such a sexist," and I'll think, well, he's of the era,
Right.
Don't get too carried away. But I would say my Sarah Lawrence students who were younger, they were either conventional age graduate students, meaning like, early 20s to 30, and I taught undergrads. And one thing that they were, part of that was really interesting to me, I had two different students in undergrad and grad who were transitioning female to male.
Mm-hmm.
And the class was completely relaxed about that. One of them came back laughing that one of the transitioning students had just won the spelling bee by spelling the word androgyny correctly. But they all thought that was hilarious. They were much more comfortable with it, than people 20 years earlier would have been. So I loved all that, and of course I got to read the writing, so I learned a lot about it. Mostly I've considered myself a feminist my whole life, certainly. So I'm interested in the forms that it takes now.
Yes, I was going to say the non-binary is very new to us. We certainly couldn't imagine it back then. We couldn't imagine it, and it's the rule now. It's fascinating. Now, okay, this past year, what a year and a half. ever expected. I mean, when we were, I mean, Nixon, doesn't Nixon look like nothing?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
old Trump era Nixon, like, first of all, the Senate, most of the Republicans in the Senate voted him out. That's why he quit. I mean, people like Diane Sawyer liked Nixon. I mean, Nixon, that was, Watergate was terrible, but there was nothing like this thing that we went through, nothing like it. And every day it got more insane, and the Republicans got more insane. And, I mean, we couldn't imagine it. And then, of course, the coronavirus, which we had never experienced either. And we're over that. And then in the middle of this racial reckoning, this incredible sense of, again, like the Me Too movement, it's beyond, I mean, for us, the civil rights movement was very important. It was very significant to me. I used to sing recite I Have a Dream all the time. I was sorry that I couldn't go and, do voter registration in the South. I was just a little too young and a little too shy and, not cool enough. But there's, now it is in the advertising culture, in the media culture, everywhere. We're seeing the sense of diversity, inclusion, in every way, in language, in images, microaggressions. I mean, we're seeing it so intensely, and this all sprang up in the middle of Trump. Did this affect you at all while you were writing this book? I mean, it was an incredible, yeah.
The book was done, but before the pandemic, just because you hand it in and then I was doing editing and stuff like that. But I feel like it was easier for me than for a lot of people because I was in the city. I live alone, and I had I'm such an urban person. I was very comforting to me to have other people nearby. I wasn't afraid of them as some people. I'm sort of not that afraid of getting sick. I mean, I have normal fears in the face of a pandemic, but I wasn't, painfully anxious. And I have a dog, so I had to go out 3 times a day, no matter what. So I actually, and of course, I liked being home. My schedule wasn't that different, except I didn't have to do a lot of things I didn't want to do. So I don't mean it was nothing. I mean, certainly the first months I would be taking my sanity walk, and there would be a big sign over the east side or the FDR Drive saying, stay in. I would think, oh, maybe I'm not supposed to take a walk. There was plenty to be anxious about, but mostly it wasn't so bad. And so, there was one point where one of my neighbors slid a note under my door. I haven't seen you in a while. Are you okay? So I felt like, and of course I talked on the phone constantly to my friends. So I kept contact that way, even when I couldn't see them. So it wasn't so bad is what I would say about it. Was that your question, or did you want to know something else?
No, that was, yeah.
Okay,
go ahead, Jeannie.
I have a question related to that. I mean, do you think that the events of the past year and a half will make it into your future work? I mean, do you see that?
I have something about the pandemic in what I'm writing now, and certainly some mention of people walking with signs during, I guess it's just a year ago that there was the death that everyone was, campaigning about. So have people walking with signs about that. But I was thinking, one of the things that I think about also is how different all literature looks to us. Because I was watching the Colson Whitehead novel, The Underground Railroad is now a series on Amazon. And I just saw the first sequence of it, which is amazing. I mean, the direction is just incredible. But I've read that book twice because I taught it to my grad students. And it hits in a whole different way now. You just think of the history differently, so I think that's terrific. I mean, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
My role in that is minor because I'm a white person. There's a limit to what I can take on, but it's definitely there. Certainly, it's felt.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting what kind of creative work will come out of from you and from all writers and artists and musicians. I mean, some of it's already started, of course, we've seen that, but correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember like 9/11 being fodder for a lot of
Right.
creative work, or am I wrong about that? I don't know. This seems like it was so universal, and it was in slow motion, and there was just I feel like that it's gonna
Mhm.
we're gonna see a lot. I don't. What do you think from that?
I think so too. I think it's going to also because all of the forms of it are so different. The ways that people were affected by pandemic can take, because what you don't want to do as a fiction writer is to echo, what everybody else is saying. And then there's a danger of that in 9/11, what I was doing when I heard the news or something.
Right, right.
But the pandemic is longer and has more variation.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Sheila, do you want me to open up for questions, or do you want to?
Yes, no, go ahead. I mean, I noticed some people have asked questions, the intimate gaze and favorite books and so forth.
Yeah,
And
so
hi, Lara Tupper.
Hey, Lara Tepper, can you? I want you to ask that question first, and then we'll get to some of the others. Lara, can you?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thanks for this. Lovely to see everybody here. I said that I'm enjoying Secrets very much, and I'm savoring it as I go along. I'm in the middle, and I said I'd love to know more about the waitressing gig. I'm so curious, and also which writers, musicians, artists were you enthralled with at that time for both Sheila and Joan, please.
Oh, I remember thinking there wasn't that much fiction that was being written at that moment for us to read. I was also, when I was really young, I was writing poetry, and I was involved with poets who were more experimental. But I waitressed first at a place called Max's Kansas City that was a big, they later became a big music venue. They were just starting to do that. But it was the
coolest place in the late 60s. Absolutely the coolest place. You couldn't, I came to New York and a woman on the street, somebody like 3 years older than me said, you have to get a job at Max's. I didn't do that, but I went there. But that was your button, your coolness button was punched if you worked there.
Well, I didn't last too long because I wasn't a very good waitress. I probably less than 2 months probably. But then I worked at a place that was kind of an offshoot. One of the bartenders from Max's opened a place called St. Adrian Company. And I worked there for 2.5 years at least, maybe longer, maybe 3 years. So it was a total of 3.5 years that I was waitressing. It was much better money than I had earned in publishing, which paid crappy for an introductory job, and I did love it. I certainly, I stopped eventually. I'd sort of done enough, but it was lively. It was terrific. You met all sorts of people. It was really fun.
Yes,
Sheila,
you know my sister there. Yes, we know each other. This is my sister.
I used to work with your sister.
Right. I worked at a place called the Hip Bagel. First, I worked at some place uptown. I can't remember the name of it. It was, and then I worked at a place called the Hip Bagel on McDougal Street. I ended up working at jazz clubs. I thought that was the coolest thing to do. I worked at a place called Slugs, and there was a murder one night afterward. Helen, I'm forgetting her name now. She murdered her jazz musician husband. I wanted to write about it.
Helen Morgan, is that right?
Helen Morgan, yes, and Lee Morgan. Yeah, she killed Lee Morgan there. Then I worked at the Needle's Eye, which is right in my neighborhood here. And so I did that, but I knew the people in Jones at St. Adrian's, and I would go in there. It was that kind of a world. I remember, and I was writing as well. I worked at a very cool magazine called I Magazine that nobody remembers, but it was Hearst trying to do a magazine for hipsters or hippies or whatever, and it was a period of time. I actually came to go to graduate school, and I really regret that I didn't at Columbia. But I'd been like a kind of a sort of a good nerdy student at Berkeley in sociology and anthropology. And I just, I couldn't get back into that when I came to New York. So it was the time. Joan, would you agree that being a waitress was cooler than like being in publishing, right? Which you would
I certainly thought so.
much yeah.
I hated having an office job too. It was, it just seemed so confining.
Very different, very different culture now.
Yes.
Very different.
Yeah.
And Natalie, you have a really good question. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure, thank you. Joan, I think I heard you, first of all, thank you both. Thank you, Sheila, for the great questions, and thank you, Joan, for taking the time, and thank you, Jeannie, for having us. But you spoke, I believe you said something about intimate gaze, and that's what interested you about having multiple characters. And I wondered if you could say more about that. And then you also mentioned that when you that you didn't yet know a character well, and I'm curious how you come to know your characters well enough to be confident to write from within their experience.
Oh, that's a great question. What was the first one? Oh, what did I mean? Well, I've always, I don't think I've ever written any other way. I'm not very good on plot, in fact, but I'm very interested in what the character is thinking, or it took me a while to understand what I wanted to do with plot. I should say that more fairly to myself. But I'm very interested in what the character is saying to herself or himself about what's going on. I just, you know, I love that in other writers. I love hearing their, you know, their version of events as they would say it to themselves. That's, you know, quite fascinating to me. So how I get to know characters is because I'm very aware. In fact, I'm just beginning a new chapter when I'm working on now, and I don't know the character well enough yet. I know the end she comes to because that's occurred in a previous chapter, but I don't know how she gets there. So I sort of do it on the job. Sometimes I take notes. Sometimes I say, oh, she would do that. No, she would do this. You know, I do kind of rough stuff. But often I'm writing a scene like, oh, she goes to dinner with her friend. Well, what are they going to talk about? How does that tie in with what happened before? You know, I'm putting my character through the paces and that way figuring out who they are. It's kind of an on-the-job process. And it's very hard at first. And I don't actually write drafts. I kind of keep revising as I go. But the early parts of anything are not very impressive. It takes a while to really get there and to have more substance to it. And maybe it's that same premise. I mean, the character gains substance as they go through experience. So I'm carrying that out in the writing of it as well.
Do you read nonfiction? Oh, sorry, was somebody else going to ask a question? Do you read nonfiction as well, Joan, or mainly fiction?
If it's relevant to what I don't, occasionally you know, someone will tell me about something being good and I'll read it, but I don't usually read nonfiction just by the way I would read fiction. Right. I have a section that takes place in China that I'm working on now. It's Hong Kong in 1930 something, and 35 probably, and I'm getting you know, so I'm reading all I can read about that, and that's fun. I love that. It's quite transporting.
And I have a question. When you do this, just please let me, I just call it tag teaming. I'm sorry, and you have a better word for it. But do you ever go back in history? I mean, you said
yeah.
So some of that leaping would be like a past character that impacted the current story. I guess you did that. Yes, you did that some in the Secrets, right? Because of like the older characters.
I did that most. Yes, I mean, so that one I just sort of moved around within like 40 years or something like that. But in the first book in this form, Ideas of Happiness, there's a section that takes place in Renaissance Venice, and because people are reading poems by a particular poet, and I just sort of made her a character. And there's a section that I loved writing, and I had letters I could use as a source of that about missionaries in China in the late 1890s to 1900. Wow. So that was, fortunately I had the woman's, I mean, I patterned my character on an actual woman whose letters were published, you know, in a book. And then I got all sorts of other information. So I wasn't just using her and was, you know, I knew a little more than she did about what was going on, the way I was doing it.
Giving the context for her. Andrea, you had a question, Andrea Stein? You want to unmute yourself?
Hi. My question was, what kind of books do you like to read to relax or entertain yourself? That's different from when you're actually working on something and you might read other books to inspire you. Guilty pleasures, for lack of a better phrase.
I like to read about food. I mean, as a relaxing sort of, so, you know, if one of my food magazines arrives, I'll drop everything to read that. You know, that's, I always say I'm interested in food the way other people are interested in sports. You know, if you went someplace, I want to know what you ate. I don't read like light fiction particularly, you know, that's not entertaining for me. I might read a kind of history that's like travelogue as a diversion sometimes. But I don't have that many other forms of entertainment, I think, except food. The food stuff is pretty strong.
Food is very big now.
Oh, is
I
it
think
good?
always,
I was ahead of my time.
Yes.
you're ahead of time. Okay.
And,
I didn't know that about you, but
and Andrea also asked about your favorite writers. I mean, who are your favorite
Oh,
writers?
the writers who've been most important to me, I love Alice Munro, and those, and she moves around a lot in time and changes perspective a lot in ways that I certainly took from. And also she has these very long stories. I mean, I feel like I learned from her that, you know, a story can have deep pockets. So some of my chapters are like that. Some of them are very, you know, you get like the Bud chapter, you get his whole life in that one. And I love doing that. And I love the idea that a shorter form can contain that. The other writer who was really important to me when I was younger was Chekhov. We had a book of Chekhov stories in the house when I was growing up, and I loved, and what he does, it's really interesting. I mean, he will have an intimate moment where you're right up close to the character, usually towards the end of the story, but he changes narrative distance a lot. So you're away from the character, then you're moving close, and then often you move away again. It's quite wonderful. I don't do that, but watching him do it was actually really important to me. I learned a huge amount from him.
great.
That's so interesting. And how did it feel then when you were compared to Alice Munro? That's one of the writers.
Oh, I was thrilled. I was, and I also, writers sometimes don't like being, you know, like, you know, why isn't she a Joan Silver? But Munro has been my favorite. I liked her when nobody liked her yet, you know, and she's been a favorite writer of mine for a really long time.
And how about Grace Paley? You were all compared to Grace Paley, right, Joan?
Well, Grace Paley was my teacher, so that's a whole different other relationship. But there was something else I was going to say. About being compared to Alice Munro. I feel that Munro has had plenty of fans, but not so many acolytes. So I'm very happy to be considered a follower of hers. That's fine. Now, Grace Paley was my teacher my last year at Sarah Lawrence. She was my teacher. And I, in fact, was writing poetry at the time. And Grace had this thing where you had to try the other genre. So I wrote a story that was my first sort of serious story. I continued to write poetry for a while afterwards, but that was, you know, it had that draw for me. And I knew that I wanted to talk about character. And Grace is always into voice. She taught us all to sort of hear the voices around us. So that was crucial for me. That training was really crucial.
And I think, sorry, Julie H., you have a question. And maybe this is part of like your research. Julie, are you there?
You're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah.
There I am now.
Yeah.
Thank you, ladies. This has been such an interesting discussion. I wanted to ask you, Joan, obviously you get inspired by people in your life that you've come across, but how is it often that it's so obvious that it's going to be somebody that you know, or a real life event that you say, oh gosh, I've got to change this significantly? And do you sometimes have a conversation with that individual beforehand?
Yes, that has happened. In Ideas of Heaven, which we were talking about, the first story is about someone who has a bad experience with her dance coach. And that's a story that was told to me by a friend when I was living abroad one year. And I felt that I understood, do you know what I mean? I made my own tune out of it, but I felt that I understood something in the story and why it had happened. And I did, I don't think I did show it to her at some point. I think it had maybe been published in a magazine, but not in a book at the time I did. And she was pleased. she was, sort of flattered that I had chosen to use it. And she also said, but, I'm not like the character that way. I'm much, and which was totally right, but I think she was more pleased than not. A couple of other times I used one story that someone I met traveling told me. And I think as far as, she's in Australia and I doubt that she's ever seen it. I used my brother as a character in one book, and people certainly recognized him. They knew that was him. In The Size of the World, that's that, part of that takes place in Vietnam, and he wasn't in the military, but he worked for a company that made actually the guidance systems for guided missiles, and he traveled to Vietnam to troubleshoot the equipment, like the character. So, and everybody who reads that knows that's him. My brother's no longer alive, so I didn't have to contend with him, or feel that I violated him, So it's complicated. In this book, there's nobody. The first story in this book about the woman who discovers her husband is has another family was told to me by my friend Meyer, of someone she knew many years ago, and neither of those real life people are alive anymore also. So there's qualifications like that.
Yeah,
I try not to be ridiculous. I try not to overstep.
I was going to ask about that, if you knew somebody who had two families, and obviously, yeah, you did. So that's interesting. It's so interesting.
I didn't know that.
You knew you knew that was an inspiration. A real life
but every time I read from that chapter, and since it's the first chapter, I read from it a lot. When I would read, when people still gave live readings, someone would come up to me afterwards and say, I had an uncle like that. I mean, that happened about 5 times. So I think it's quite a more common phenomenon than we even know.
But the DNA testing is finding all that out, right? I mean, all that's being revealed now. Elaine, Eva, I'm trying to, you had a question here?
Yes, hi, thank you for hosting this great event. Budding author myself, I'm working on a memoir, and I find that the story just consumes me. For the first 6 months of this year, I was waking up every night at 3:15, and I just have thoughts and storylines floating in my head and conversations, and it was actually very disturbing. I mean, and then of course morning comes in at 6 and I have to really face the day and I'm exhausted. The story consumes me, and I wonder how you manage your character development in that.
I think it's good. And when the story is consuming you, that's obviously a good sign, because you want it to consume the reader, right? You want that intensity in the story. I am a relative, I've been doing this so long that my habits are kind of steady. I work between lunch and dinner, although I probably started around 3, I work 3 to 7 or something like that. But I know I'm going to be doing it. I wouldn't, sometimes I do think about it all the time, and I won't work until the afternoon. I don't work well in the morning, but the thoughts of it might be with me. It's not usually uncomfortable. I'm not unhappy to be obsessed, is I guess the short answer to that question.
Thank you.
Interesting. So do you in the mornings, is that when you're
No.
processing? Just doing your business, going around, are things turning around? Do you need time for things to just marinate in your head, and then you sit down to, what I'm saying is, does that help you in your writing process to have that time where you know that you're not scheduled to be writing? Do you see what I'm saying?
It does in the writing process, and even when I go to art colonies and you have time to write all day and no responsibilities, I've never been able to start writing before like maybe 11 o'clock or something, that if I'm really pushing it, and I'm not really working seriously until after lunch. That's just my particular rhythms. It's a little unusual. Most people work in the mornings.
Do you get up early, or do you just sort of hang in bed?
I get up at a normal time, I don't know, 7:30, 8:30, something like that. But I have there are plenty of other things to do, right? Not most of us can't work 8 hours a day, So it certainly, sometimes it's in my head, sometimes I'm not thinking of it till I sit down. It will depend completely on where I am in the the piece, and also whether, you know, whether it's going well or whether I'm stuck, so I don't even want to think about it. You know, it really depends on the emotional quality of what I'm working on at that moment.
That's so cool.
Great.
So and I just think that you know, Sheila, knowing that you and Joan have been friends, and I just love to see accomplished women and, you know, succeed. And I like the idea that you guys were young and you were at that at age when there was no guarantee, you know, you didn't know what the end result was going to be. And you know, both of you have had great success with writing, and it must be such a satisfying feeling to see each other succeed like this.
Well, I'm very impressed with Joan.
Sheila was writing way before I was. She was way ahead of me. She was writing for magazines and stuff.
I was writing for magazines for a long time. Yes.
Yeah. So her career started long before.
Yeah. And we did things. We went to my house, to a house that I rented, and the pictures of the house that we owned. And then I remember Anne, just a lot of stages. And we were at the South of France. I mean, this is ages and ages ago when you came through. And I remember your New Year's Eve parties that you used to give in your other apartment. Those are nice. Those are fun.
They were New Year's Day.
New Year's Eve parties. New Year's Day parties. Sorry, not New Year's Day parties. And all of many things. Yes.
Did you ever talk about writing? I know you were doing different types.
Oh yeah, we talked about writing all the time and what we were reading.
Did we? I'm trying to remember. We did.
We talked, and you always liked Alice Adams, and I didn't like Alice Adams.
I did like Alice Adams. Yes, you didn't like Alice Adams?
Not particularly. No.
Oh,
but
okay.
Like people you didn't like, you know.
Okay, yeah, no, I loved Alice Adams. Yes, I did. I didn't remember that we talked about Alice Adams. Yes.
Yeah.
No, I always wanted to write the book that ended up as Girls Like Us. We talked about many things. And I think we're due to have a drinks date or something.
We're definitely due to have a drink, but I would think we probably talked most about our love lives.
Oh!
That was the most fascinating thing to us. Whether they were good, bad, or indifferent, that was like, you know,
right.
Things.
And I think that's the
we'll
thing.
Keep that quiet.
Yeah. But that's the thing that people, a lot of people or men or the culture overlooks is that we can talk. I mean, we have the ability to be completely silly and talk about boy crushes, and then deep, you know, comparing the qualities of Alice Adams' writing. You know, I mean, I think that's what we're completely capable of doing, all of that. And I think that and we still are. I mean, that's what Next Tribe, what we try to fight against is that this idea that, you know, at a certain age you just are supposed to act a certain way, or there's a set path. You know, everyone has such incredibly different experiences of getting to this age, and I think that that's what we try to do, is celebrate the whole gamut of a woman at this age. So, well, I don't know. I think I got all your questions in, and if is there anybody else that's, I think not. I think I got them all. But what a great time with you, Joan and Sheila.
Really.
And I think that we all need to go out and after reading Secrets of Happiness, I am committed to going back to your other books, because I'm sorry I hadn't read your other books, but now I'm definitely going back. And I love this idea of interconnectivity. And it's kind of, I think your books are kind of the personification of the 6 degrees of separation, you know, that kind of like the interconnectivity of life and the weave of our culture and our social lives and personal lives. So it's fascinating, and it makes me think of like, who's the character or am I a character in somebody else's story that I don't know about? You know, like maybe a minor one, and I just don't, or something. It makes you really think about it.
Just what I wanted, that sense of I always quote my mother, who used to say, I was not happy to hear this, "You're not the only pebble on the beach." Mother,
that's a good thing to know. Sometimes I don't know it.
But I love that sense now of, I don't, also I'm definitely at a stage, but I don't want to be the center of everything, but the sense that we, you know, that I'm a minor character in somebody else's story is exactly the feeling that I want and that I want the books to convey. Definitely. Thank you for saying that.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks and thanks everyone for coming tonight.
Yes, thank you.
I'm gonna,
Good to see you, Andrea Stein and Lara and Judy was here. Judy Frisky, Fran. Hi.
a lot of great
All the people. Yes.
devoted fans, and we appreciate all of you coming. And let's see if I got any miss. Ooh, yes. Oh my gosh, I missed Fran's story question. I'm sorry, Fran. Anyway, we're out of time, so I want to.
She's muted. Yeah.
But thanks to everyone, and thank you especially Joan and Sheila.
And Joan, we'll make a date. Okay, I'll take care for you. Okay, we will.
All right, take care. Have a good evening.
Bye, everybody. Jeannie, we'll continue our conversation. Yes. Okay.
Bye-bye.